You guys remember when that 40-mile convoy of military vehicles in the first week of the war was coming down from Belarus to Kiev, and how on the day 4 of the war it stopped because they forgot fuel, and on day 7 all the soldiers walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food? That underlined for NATO that Russia has forgotten how to fight a war, not just from the Soviet times, but from the Tsarist times. They're relearning how to do everything from scratch. The Russians feel that they cannot be physically secure unless they can block the territories that allow access to the heartland. They're facing a demographic collapse. They know if they don't expand militarily now, they won't be able to in the future. And those access points that they need, Ukraine isn't one of them. Ukraine is in the unfortunate position on being on the way to 2 of them. So from the Russian point of view, Ukraine is just a step. And when they are done with Ukraine, if they are successful, they will come for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania, NATO countries. So we know, if they win, that the next fight will be with us. But they don't know how to fight a conventional war any longer. So the defense estimates that I have seen suggest 1,000 to 1 casualty ratios. They're doing worse than the Iraqis did in '92. But they see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are right. So there will be a nuclear exchange. Just to underline that, if Ukraine loses, we will lose cities. And so the opportunity cost here, to put it in your parlance, wow. Never before has there been an opportunity to leverage so little to get so much. Whether or not Ukraine can win, we're going to find out this year. It's been mud season. The Ukrainians can't fight a war of attrition. They don't have the numbers. They have to find a way to get a strategic advantage that allows them to go from the 2 to 3 to casualty ratio, 2 to 3 to 1, to something closer to 8 to 10. That's the only way Ukraine wins. They can't do that when they can't move, and the mud season has prevented them from moving. By the time we get to May, mud season will be over. We will probably have these main battle tanks in place, but for every battle tank that the West has committed to this point, the Russians are going to have another 5,000 men on the front. It's a classic Sparta versus Athens, and by the time we get to June, we were going to know which of those 2 strategies is going to be more successful. And then we will know who will win. We won't know when. For Ukraine to win, Russia doesn't just have to lose its military capacity in Ukraine. It has to lose its military capacity to project power at all. And that will lead to a political shift and maybe even a regime collapse within the Russian system. But even before we get there, Halliburton took a moral stance on the war. Anyone who wants to put money in or do business with Russia has to consider that you are now in an ethical bucket that is closer to Attila the Hun than Halliburton. You know, you want to look under the hood and look at rule of law, you want to look at corruption, you want to look at efficiency, but you've got to make it clear that you're going to go places that Nazi Germany didn't. That's what you're going to be a part of if you want to play in that field. Because of that, other companies took their moral guidance from Halliburton. And we've seen a collapse in the capacity of Western techs and capital to get into the Russian space to maintain infrastructure. Their fertilizer industry, just to pick one, was built in the 1960s. It does not work without that foreign stuff. Most of the wells that were drilled in eastern Siberia, upwards of 95% of them, were not done by the Russians. So we are seeing a not so slow motion collapse of the entire Russian industrial space. And the only thing that will fix it is if folks like you throw their own personal money into projects that Halliburton wouldn't. I don't think that's very likely. But think about what that means. Not only are we going to be losing over the next several years in bits and pieces or all at once, it could go any number of directions, we're losing the world's 2nd largest exporter of crude and refined product. We're losing the largest source of palladium, the 2nd largest source of platinum group materials, the 3rd largest source of copper, the 3rd largest source of titanium and aluminum. You know, this has very real consequences. Part of the economic story that you guys have all made mad money on is since 1990, when the world all unified in the late globalization era, is we brought in huge chunks of territory that had not been economically metabolized. This is China, this is Brazil, this is Russia. That is now all unwinding with lightning speed. And anything that requires the base materials to function, we now have to get by without less. So if you want to support an industrial and economic trend, you have to now do it with less copper and nickel and the rest. And that means, among other things, that the green transition can't happen. We just don't have the stuff. We have never, in the history of humanity, doubled the industrial production of any material that we were already using within 10 years. And we now need 3 times as much copper and 4 times as much chromium and 10 times as much aluminum and 10 times as much lithium and 18 times as much graphite. And we're losing Russia, making that statistically impossible. Think of a demographic structure like a pyramid. You've got lots of children at the bottom, very few retirees at top, and just mortality builds it up like that. When you've got a lot of folks under age 40, you've got a consumption-based system that is driven by what people are doing to build their homes and buy their cars. High inflation, high consumption tends to be high import as well. But as technology improves, as you industrialize and urbanize, your population structure turns into a chimney. And that's kind of the magic moment, because you've got a lot of people aged 20 to 45 who are consuming, and a lot of people aged 40 to 65 who are investing. A good balance of consumption and productive workers. And that is the moment that most of the world has been in between roughly 1980 and 2015. But as you keep aging, you eventually open up into an inverted pyramid. And you don't go back from that, because your birth rate has now been too low for 50 years. It's not that you're running out of children. That happened 30 years ago. You are now running out of adults. That's Germany. That's China. In 20 years, that'll be India. Most of the world's advanced economic systems have aged past the point of no return. We're going through a moment in the West and in the United States where the baby boomers are finally retiring. And we've thought about that from a fiscal point of view, and that's relevant. I don't want to try to talk anyone out of that. But have you ever thought of what it means for you? Because this is the world's single largest source of capital. And on average, the world's baby boomers retired in December. We're already past the tipping point. Not tipping point in terms of recovery. We passed that as a world 30, 40 years ago. I'm talking about the availability of capital at all. We've seen the cost of capital roughly triple in the last 2 years. We're going to see that again in the next year or two. That's baked into the pie. So we're entering a world where we've got a labor shortage because boomers retiring, a capital shortage because the boomers are changing their investment portfolio. And in most parts of the world, there's not a consumption base to maintain this concept we have called globalization. Because ultimately, trade is about someone buying something. If you don't have a lot of people aged 20 to 45, there's not a lot of that going on. Northeast Asia and Western Europe are where these trends are most advanced. But the parts of the world where they are advancing most quickly are Russia and Ukraine. So even if we can avoid a general nuclear exchange, even if the Ukrainians continue being the David to Russia's Goliath and actually take it down, we still need a fundamentally different economic model. And the European Union is not going to be part of that. Because remember, not only do the Germans have a starkly terminal demography, they have based their entire manufacturing system on an energy provider that can no longer provide energy. There's nothing about that system that survives this decade. And that's a very different geospatial and economic system of relationships that we at the moment have yet to invent a theory to frame, much less come up with some sort of industrial policy, much less come up with a financial way to play with that in a world with less finance.